Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us here at Fuqua with LinkedIn Live. My name is Professor John Heater, and today I get to present to you some of my own work with a paper titled CFO Co-option and CEO Compensation. So I will share that video with you, or share my slides with you, and you could follow along as I present this. So, brief introduction. Again, I'm a professor of accounting here at the Fuqua School of Business, and my main research areas involve looking into managerial incentives from financial reporting, looking at disclosure, and looking at corporate governance. Again, all kind of related to this financial reporting and financial disclosure. I'll be answering any questions you have. Please leave them in the comment section below. And remember that we have a LinkedIn Live session where Fuqua faculty will come to you live every week at Wednesday, 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. So I want to jump right into the study's findings so that we all kind of understand what we're looking at here in this paper. So again, the paper's title involves a few things: so CEO compensation, CFO co-option. Well, what do we mean by this? So the Wall Street Journal picked up this paper that we published in Management Science and noted that some finance chiefs might be pressured to tweak earnings to boost stock price. And that's the main idea of the paper. What we have studied and what we find is that when the CEO has hired the CFO, there is a compensation premium to that CEO. In fact, it's about 10% more on average. So when you think about the compensation premium, that's a rather high amount of money. And before we delve into what we specifically find, I want to ask the question, well, why do we even investigate this relationship? So I would say it's arguable, but the CEO-CFO relationship is probably one of the most important interpersonal relationships at a public company. A Korn Ferry survey of 321 finance chiefs in 2017, when they asked the CFO why they would voluntarily leave their position, more than half suggested that it's a poor working relationship with the CEO. And 41% said that not working well with the board and the CEO is a top reason that a CFO would be asked to leave. So this kind of interpersonal relationship really pushes on a couple of key ideas and leads us into our research questions. Is a CFO's appointment during a CEO's tenure, what we coin or what we call CFO co-option, associated with higher pay? And that kind of core question really comes about from this kind of an investigation here, where the CFO's relationship with the CEO seems to be very important, both for the CFO's tenure and important for the CEO for this reason here, the compensation effects. Specifically, we look at whether or not the early years of a CFO's tenure is associated with this higher pay. And we're going to, as I go through the presentation, I'm going to chop it up into two components. You may have a CEO and a CFO working together, or you may have a CEO kind of pressuring a CFO to do certain things. If that relationship in early years is important, well, how might a newly co-opted CFO actually influence that compensation level that we suggested does happen? Well, do these newly co-opted CFOs influence a specific form of compensation? The fixed component, which is the salary, the variable, which is the bonus or equity, or maybe both. In addition, are these newly co-opted CFOs, these new CFOs that are hired by a CEO, are they doing something in the accounting to hit earnings targets that are pretty much explicit for the CEO, that the CEO wants to achieve so that they get extra compensation? Furthermore, does the management of these earnings go in predictable directions? And is there something related to this cost to bias of a CFO? So let's dig a little bit more into it. So conceptually, I'd break up the CEO-CFO partnership into two broad categories. One may be synergistic. And an example of this is from Ward Nye and Ann Lloyd from Martin Marietta Materials. So they're an aggregate materials company. And I'll just recite what's over here. In an interview about Lloyd's award, Nye said that it was Lloyd's fierce loyalty and dedication to her job that impressed him the most. Ann takes ownership. And Lloyd had advice last year to folks wanting to follow in her footsteps. Find a place with people that can fulfill and make your day happy, because you're going to spend a lot of time with those people. And I bolded that for emphasis. The reason is because if you find a good pairing between the CEO and the CFO, there could be a lot of synergies. There could be a lot of additional production, a lot of very good efficiencies that can arise from a good partnership. So it's not so much the case that we want to limit the ability of the CEO to pick a good CFO. What we are concerned with is that second bullet point, hierarchical power. If the CEO pressures the CFO to present numbers that kind of affect stock price in a way that is beneficial to the CEO, that could generate some adverse effects for the firm itself, at least for financial reporting standards. In addition, we look at the younger tenure of CFOs, the CFOs that were just recently hired, because that's going to be an area where the CEO can exert a lot of pressure. You can think back to the first time you started a new job. First time you started a new job, generally what's going to happen is you'll have this situation where you want to listen to the boss. You want to make sure the boss is happy. You want to impress the boss. And this is the kind of broad cut that we're going to look at to try to tease out, well, when you have a CEO and CFO partnership, is that 10% increase in salary to the CEO because of a synergistic relationship or because of a pressured relationship? Okay. What are some examples of CEO coming in and hiring a new CFO? Well, Harley-Davidson has recently done this, and they had a new CEO takeover during the whole coronavirus crisis to kind of reshuffle their strategy to approach a new productive scheme. So what happened is Mr. Zeitz, who came on earlier in the year, immediately got a new CFO, and they wanted to do so because they wanted to overhaul the business. And again, this could be because of synergistic relationships to make sure that the business is running good, or it could be because the CEO may come up with a way to make sure that the financial reporting turns out good. In addition, you'll see Ford CEO doing the same. And this is a common theme where a new CEO will come in and the CEO will make sure that the team that they have is in line with their expectations. And again, our question and our broad motivation for looking at this is to make sure that when we're looking at board hiring practices, that there's a good role of the CEO with the CFO that results in that kind of a synergistic relationship, not so much a pressured relationship. In addition, there's also some other broad motivations, at least from the research angle. So one thing that researchers like myself, and I would say also practitioners, are concerned with is executive compensation and how executive compensation incentivizes managers to do certain things. The board of directors are going to care about a competitive pay versus a rent extraction perspective. Now, you want to make sure you have competitive pay for a CEO, because competitive pay will allow the CEO to feel like they're being compensated correctly and exert lots of effort to make sure the firm is returning its profits as efficiently as possible. In addition, you may have a situation where a CEO can potentially extract rents, where the CEO has a compensation contract that allows them to get pay regardless of firm performance and regardless of the investors being receiving benefits of that performance. There's also other papers that use this term co-option, and they use it for other kind of roles. So there's a paper by Coles et al., 2013, that looks at co-opted boards. So again, we're looking at co-opted CFOs. There's research that would suggest that CEOs can influence up the hierarchy. And as a CEO predates certain members of the board coming online, those CEOs have better, or at least higher forms of compensation. Similarly, what we're going to look is down the hierarchy, and we're going to look at specifically the power relationship between the CEO and CFO. Furthermore, the CEO and CFO role had a large change in the regulatory sphere after Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. So what happened in the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002, there was kind of a large upwelling, a watershed moment in the regulatory regime of accounting. Prior to 2002, you had firms like Enron, WorldCom that kind of went bust because of poor accounting practices and sometimes outright fraud. So what Sarbanes-Oxley did was make managers, specifically the CEO and the CFO, strictly liable for any kind of issues that would arise regarding financial reporting. This is an important regulatory timing for us because it will allow us to look at an increase to what we call a cost to bias from the CFO. Once the CFO realizes that there's a lot more scrutiny on the accounting function, the CFO will be more prone to push back against the CEO because the CFO will not want to have kind of the SEC and other regulatory authorities question their accounting and question potentially things that they could get in a lot of trouble for. Again, some other related literature, just to kind of give you an idea of what else is out there and why we're studying the specific thing we are. Feng et al. 2011 look at the CFO instigation of manipulations and whether or not the CEO pressured that CFO. Well, they find evidence in line with that hypothesis. They find that CEOs, on average, will get more benefits than the CFO when there's some kind of accounting manipulation involved. And they also find that when there are manipulations, the CEO power is relatively high versus the CFO. Furthermore, the stronger the equity incentives, specifically the compensation that's related to stock incentives, the larger those are for the CEO, the more likely manipulation from the CFO is going to occur. So the implication and the inference you can make from that line of research is that CEOs do appear to pressure the CFO. There's some other literature that would suggest the contrary, that CFO incentives are also strongly related to positive earnings surprises. And that kind of led to a wedge in the research literature. And the question is, well, is it because the CEOs are incentivized to do it, or is it because the CFOs are incentivized to do it that accounting manipulation occurs? So Friedman, 2014, wraps up that literature and says, well, you can have both situations. And mainly, the thing that separates these two findings is where the CEO can pressure the CFO and where that cost to bias exists, and which is why I mentioned Sarbanes-Oxley earlier. So when we're thinking about how to structure this test, this is how we're kind of developing our theoretical mindset when we're investigating the question. If the CEO is approving of the CFO candidate, they're going to approve potentially a candidate that is most likely to have a positive outlook for the CEO's economic payoff. In this situation, we would believe that it's a co-opted CFO, a CFO that is hired by the CEO, that would potentially take actions to improve that CEO's economic payout. Furthermore, we can't just roll out synergies, and we can't roll out that the CEO is getting higher pay because the relationship between the CEO and the CFO is very positive. So one thing that we're going to assume implicitly is that as the relationship between the CEO and the CFO continues, it must be that longer term relationships between CEOs and CFOs must have been because of a synergistic relationship. Meaning, let's say, for example, a CEO and CFO pair have been together for 4 or more years. Well, that's likely to suggest that they are a synergistic relationship and that is going to improve over time. If it weren't, it's likely that the CEO would have probably tried to or attempted to replace the CFO prior to that. So how could a CFO under the hierarchical power pressure regime take actions to improve the stock price to benefit the CEO? Things that we're going to look at specifically are achieving earnings targets, but there are some other things as well. There could be deal-making activities, persuading the board for strategic initiatives, as well as different kinds of earnings management, which we'll get into in a second. They could also provide subjective feedback to the board about the CEO's performance, and something less likely is influence the compensation committee. So again, we're going to be focused mainly on this achievement of earnings targets in the market. This is how we structure the study in kind of like a flow chart design, so you can get an idea of how we're going to look at it. So our first hypothesis is that you will have CFO co-option, which again is going to be a situation where the CEO has hired the CFO, and under that relationship, we expect CEO compensation total pay to be higher. Specifically, we're going to cut our study on early tenure CFOs and late tenure CFOs. We expect that if there's a hierarchical power relationship where the CEO is pressuring the CFO to get the compensation, the main effect will be isolated to the co-opted CFOs that have a 0 to 3 year tenure at the firm. whereas you will have less of an effect on CEO compensation greater than 4 years. So again, in the first couple years of a CFO's tenure, we expect the power relationship to be the strongest. Meaning if we find the effect of increased CEO compensation in those early year relationships, it must be because of a hierarchical power, not necessarily a synergistic power. So what do we find in the actual paper? Well, we find, in effect, higher CEO compensation when the CEO has hired their CFO. And again, as consistent with what I've been suggesting, we find that that effect is mainly within the first couple years of a CFO's tenure at the firm. In fact, we find no boosted CEO compensation for CEOs that have a CFO that have been at the firm for 4 years or longer. We then dig deeper into this question to figure out what component of pay has been affected by it. Is it the fixed component or the variable component? What we want to make sure of is that if the variable component is being affected, which we do find, what is the mechanism that the CFO is potentially using to benefit the CEO? One thing that is very broadly accepted in the literature and definitely by practitioners is that achieving your targets, your earnings targets, is a very good way to make sure that your variable compensation, your equity compensation, your bonus, et cetera, is increased from year over year. In addition, CEOs generally have a lot of existing shareholder equity within the firm that they work for. So hitting these earnings targets will boost their compensation in two ways. Both the flow compensation, the stuff that the CEO gets per year, as well as the wealth that they generate from existing shares that they hold. Well, how can a CEO hit these earnings targets, where I have here labeled in the box a narrow meet or beat of earnings targets? They can do so through two things. They can do it through either accruals earnings management, which requires some kind of manipulation of the accounting rules, or at least some kind of bending of the rules, or real earnings management. Accruals earnings management is something that the CFO can get in a little bit of trouble for if they bend the rules too far, whereas real earnings management is changing real operations and is protected by the business judgment rule and shouldn't run afoul of any kind of regulatory issues. So pre-Sarbanes-Oxley, before there was a large cost of bias, we find that accruals earnings management is the tool that the CFOs are using to hit earnings targets and boost CEO pay, whereas after the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, there is a real earnings management substitution, meaning that this cost of bias has affected the way that CFOs are boosting CEO compensation. So again, this is the summary of the hypotheses. And what I want to do, because I definitely want to take some questions, I just want to go over to the results real quickly, the sample, and we'll wrap up and I'll answer any of your questions that you may have. So we look at a sample period of 1993 to 2015 of S&P 1500 firms. We get data from very from very well-used databases, ExecuComp, CompuStat, and CRISP, as well as IBIS. We have about 17,726 firm year observations with which we do our study. Again, our CFO co-option measure is going to be an indicator equal to 1 if the CFO was appointed after the CEO, and that occurs for about 67% of our sample, where about 50% of our sample is newly co-opted CFOs. Again, some variables of interest, we're going to look at total compensation, as well as whether or not the firm meet or beat analyst expectations, and then control for already existing known results, such as board co-option. I'll skip over the descriptives and just get right to the main finding. So the main finding here, you can see in column 3, is that when a CFO is co-opted by the CEO, that 0.100 is a 10% increase in their compensation. Furthermore, when you cut the variable on young versus old tenured CFOs, you find that the main result is concentrated in those early year CFO tenures. Furthermore, we find in columns 2 and 3 on this slide that the CFO co-option being in younger years is isolated mainly through the variable compensation and specifically through CEO equity awards. Turning now to whether or not the CFO is able to adjust earnings in a way that will boost or at least beat the expectations, we find that, again, they use discretionary accruals, again, those modified accruals that potentially can have some issue with the regulatory rules. We find that that is concentrated in the younger CFO tenures to hit that earnings target and meet or beat by at least a penny. We find that it is turned on prior to SOX and diminishes or disappears after Sarbanes-Oxley in 2002 and is substituted for real earnings management here. We further show that this is not in any other bucket. It's only in that one little sliver of a bucket that is right just above the expectations, which is a sign that it is just pushed slightly above the benchmark that CEOs and CFOs need to hit their earnings targets. We do some other robustness checks. We check whether or not it's a CEO expertise. We find that this is kind of statistically insignificant. It doesn't seem to be an isolated effect of just the CEO's ability. We also use a multiple imputation statistical model to make sure that the missing values of board co-option are not driving the results. We also do some other kind of variations in compensation model determinants, including or excluding firm risk, et cetera. None of this seems to change the main inferences of the paper. Some other kind of thoughts that we've been thinking of and how we could extend this paper is, well, how may auditors respond to this co-option effect? Furthermore, does this co-option effect exist for other managers, the COO, Chief Operating Officer, the Chief Management Officer, the Chief Technology Officer? In addition, we can also look at whether or not the compensation can occur in other ways. So we're still developing those kinds of ideas. And finally, we haven't really found anything related to CFOs reaping any benefits. We checked, and it doesn't seem like the CFO is reaping any other benefits other than continuing at their post. So in conclusion, what we find is that the appointment of a CFO during a CEO's tenure appears to matter for estimating pay levels. We find that it generally increases their total pay by about 10%. We find that the channel seems to be through managing earnings to hit earnings targets, using accrual-based earnings management in the pre-SOX window, and real earnings management used in the post-SOX window. And we find overall that the benefits of increased compensation for the CEO will result in a pressuring relationship between the CEO and the CFO. So I'm going to leave it here for any questions that you may have, and I'm going to bring them up right here. So, okay, first question. Do you see any additional effects because of Dodd-Frank in 2010? Very good question. So there was the Sarbanes-Oxley Act that occurred in 2002, and that kind of changed a lot of the accounting rules and the rules related to how firms should file their financial reports. The Dodd-Frank Act in 2010 further extended some of those rules and added something, for example, like a whistleblower hotline. So any kind of employee that may have seen any kind of misdeeds or anything within the firm, that could be, you could inform the SEC about that and let the SEC know, hey, there's some bad stuff going on with the accounting here. So we actually checked whether or not the effect was even further mitigated after Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, and we didn't find anything additional. So it seems like the real thing that really kicked it into overdrive and kind of put a lid on a lot of the earnings management was the Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. Other questions? What are some examples of accrual earnings management? Very good question. So the earnings management that we're focused on in this paper has to do with some kinds of accounting estimates that CFOs have a lot of discretion in making. So you can think of a situation where a firm will sell their product on credit. They do this because they want to make sure that they increase sales and they trust their customers will pay at a later time. However, there's always a situation where a customer may or may not pay at that later time. So what the FASB and the US GAAP accounting rules say, you may have a situation where the modification of the estimate of bad debts will become a little less conservative, meaning they can go from saying, hey, we believe that we won't collect 5% of our accounts receivable down to 3%, meaning they'll take less expense and boost earnings in the short term. Now, again, accounting catches up with you and they'll have to pay for that later on. However, for the short run, they'll at least hit their earnings target. Very good question. I have an audience question from Robert Price. Are you seeing the controller role being separated from the hierarchy of the CFO? Excellent question. So there was a recent Wall Street Journal article looking at the advent of something called the Chief Accounting Officer. So what a lot of firms are doing nowadays is thinking about the role of the Chief Finance Officer separate from the financial reporting role. I do see this coming up more and more, and we're actually, and a few of the researchers that I mentioned earlier, we're thinking about ways that the CAO, the Chief Accounting Officer, may have a differing relationship than the CFO. And for those firms that have a Chief Accounting Officer, what's really going on is the CFO will focus on the financing of the firm, making sure the firm's strategy, planning, and financing of the firm as a whole is efficient, whereas the Chief Accounting Officer is solely focused on the financial reporting aspect and communication to investors. That could separate those two things that could separate those two roles and lead to a more efficient financial reporting process and a more efficient financing process. So I think you're going to see more of that in the future. Okay, so in addition, I have a question from Nisarg Amin. What is the role or impact of the board in this relationship? So the board is mainly charged with hiring of the executive team, the C-suite. So when you're thinking about the C-suite and the people that are going to be a part of the management of the company, the board must make sure that the individuals that they hire are both qualified as well as trustworthy. Now, the question here is that when the board, whether or not they have some kind of co-option related to the CEO, meaning that the CEO may have some influence over that board, the CEO may be able to hire or at least influence the hiring of a CFO that is more in line with their thinking, more in line with their kind of economic future, right? So what I would suggest is the role or the impact that the board should take from this paper is to consider the potential relationship and the potential incentives that a CEO may have for favoring one CFO candidate versus another. In addition, I would also suggest that the board look into and look over having an open line of communication with a CFO to make sure that the CFO feels like they have support behind them, so that if they do feel pressured to do any kind of accounting tricks or weird accounting estimates, that they can push back and rely on the board to protect their own interests. That way you can reduce the cost of bias, you can reduce the potential issues that may arise from having the CEO pressure the CFO. Very good. I think that's all the time I have, and I very much appreciate the questions. What I will do is send you off with a reminder for next week. So thank you for joining us this week. Great questions. I appreciate them. Next week, we're going to pause our LinkedIn Live series for the Thanksgiving holiday. We'll tune back in on Wednesday, December 2nd, where my colleague, accounting professor Xu Zhang, will discuss his research on banning short sells during a crisis. Follow Fuqua on LinkedIn to be alerted to this and other events. Thank you all for having me. Thank you for allowing me to present my work. And if you have any questions, you know where to find me on LinkedIn. See you, and thank you very much.